I've been a Nintendo fan for as long as I can remember. My first gaming console was a Game Boy Advance SP. I spent long car trips playing Super Mario Bros., Pokemon, and other third-party licensed Nintendo games. Eventually, my parents would buy me a game that would change my perception of games and raise my standards to what a good game really is. For my 6th birthday, my parents took me to Toys R Us to pick out a new game for my Game Boy. There was this cool golden colored box that sat behind the glass. I knew I had to have it, and no other game sitting on the shelf looked nearly as interesting. The game that my parents bought me was my first Legend of Zelda experience. They bought me The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This wasn't like any other first-party Nintendo games that I played. It wasn't an RPG, and it wasn't a platformer either. This was my first adventure story-based game. I defeated the Gerudo King Ganon in an attempt to save Hyrule and Princess Zelda. However, it's that last part, Save Princess Zelda, that is the most important. Similar to how every Super Mario game ends with Mario saving Peach, every Zelda game ended with Link rescuing Zelda. This essay seeks to use Laura Mulvey's understanding of visual pleasure to analyze the Legend of Zelda franchise by answering a few key questions. Who is the primary audience for the franchise? What is Zelda's role in the franchise? What is Link's role in the franchise? And what perspective is the player supposed to have, and what does each character look like in the eyes of the player? Determining who Zelda games are made for is a bit tricky. There are multiple ways you can measure who the main audience is. The amount of legacy content put out by the Zelda team aimed at older audiences such as myself for nostalgia, the ESRB, which is an organization that literally decides the audience for video games and other entertainment like movies. Lastly, one could consider the opinion of the current director of the Zelda franchise, Eiji Aonuma. If we were to combine all of these theories for measuring the main audience of the franchise, it would be safe to say that these games are created for a wide range of individuals, and many age ranges and groups of people enjoy the franchise. Ultimately, how people see Zelda as a character might differentiate depending on age. Going back to Mulvey's theory of visual pleasure, Mulvey discusses the pleasure in looking at another person as an erotic object. Ego libido acts as formations mechanisms which cinema has played on. The image of a woman as raw material for the gaze of a man takes the argument a step further. A younger audience who is relatively new to this franchise would play a game like Breath of the Wild, might see Zelda as a sort of celestial being. Oftentimes when playing a game for the first time, buying into a character's role is a lot easier. However, for more veteran players like myself, going to play any Zelda game, old or new, where the premise is saving the princess could take the magic out of the experience just a bit. Instead of seeing Zelda as a magical being like a younger player would, objectifying her as an obstacle to ultimately defeat Ganon, or whoever the main antagonist is more likely to occur. As stated earlier, similar to how every Super Mario game ended with Mario saving Peach, every Legend of Zelda game ends with Link saving Zelda. However, besides being the Princess of Hyrule, I never really stopped to consider what Zelda's bigger role in the franchise could be. Sure, one could argue that she is the typical damsel in distress, and that she can't really defend herself. However, that argument is met with yet another rebuttal. What about Zelda's appearances in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise? She's been a staple in Smash Bros. Since Melee, and has had opportunities to show Zelda and Nintendo fans in general that she's more than helpless. As her moves and abilities reflect her capabilities from mainline Zelda games, so she really isn't as helpless as fans are led to believe by the Zelda team, then why is she never able to fend for herself in mainline games, and why is she so submissive to male authorities such as Link and especially her father, the King of Hyrule? There seems to be an importance of phallocentrism that allows male characters to exceed in the world of Hyrule, and women are left as side characters where they aren't seen as heroes of their own stories. Instead, they are kidnapped, and the most dignifying role they play is as researchers or goddesses to be admired. In her writing, Mulvey says the paradox of phallocentrism and all of its manifestations is that it depends on the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world. It's her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence. In other words, it is Zelda's suffering and her lack of ability to fend for herself that gives the land of Hyrule and the protagonist meaning. It sounds simple. If the princess was able to defend herself from evil, then what would even be the point of Link? Now having established Zelda's role in the franchise, now we must find Link's role in the franchise. As stated earlier, it's Zelda's suffering that gives Link his purpose and his drive in most, if not all, the games. However, as many games as I have played in the franchise, I never really stopped to consider why Link even cares about Zelda. In most games, Link starts off as a regular person who is going about his village life. Something terrible happens, and somehow fate brings Link, Zelda, and Ganon together. But what is the nature of the relationship between Link and Zelda? And what does that say about Link's role in the franchise? Writer for The Gamer and author of an article titled Legend of Zelda 25 Crazy Secrets About Link and Zelda's Relationship, Rin Fontes writes, most of the time, Link and Zelda maintain a strictly platonic relationship, even with a few instances of them having a professional one. The few times Link and Zelda actually line up together are exceptions to the rule. They're friends first and lovers second. I think this is particularly interesting given the non-platonic relationship between Mario and Peach, who obviously have feelings for one another. Link sees his obligation to the royal family as professional. He protects Zelda in most cases because he is bound to an oath. For example, there's a scene in the game, actually it's the first memory you're supposed to unlock. Zelda and other champions of Hyrule are participating in a ceremony declaring Link as the knight with the sword that seals the darkness. There's a line from Urbosa that really stuck with me regarding Link's role in not just the game, but the franchise as a whole. She says, "That boy Link is a living reminder of her own failures. Well, at least that's how the princess sees him. Think about Zelda's role in Hyrule. She's the princess. Her job is to protect her people from harm. Half the time she can't even protect herself. Link serves as a reminder of her own failure to her duties as a princess. The reminder itself is the role Link plays throughout the franchise. This backs up Mulvey's conclusion that it is her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence." I love these games. I've been a fan of the franchise since I was a kid, and still am as an adult. I don't think anything will change that unless Zelda goes to space or something. However, I never really stopped to analyze the franchise until now. Everything from Link and Zelda's relationship to how people perceive the main protagonist was up in the air for discussion. I've come to realize a lot. For one, I always assumed Link and Zelda were romantically bonded. In some capacity, I came to that conclusion because of the amount of times they've been reincarnated and still found each other in future and past lives. I also never really saw playing as strictly Link in the Zelda games as problematic. Despite being a kid's game, Zelda usually has a relatively small role to play in her own salvation and the salvation of her own kingdom, despite it being her duty to protect it. Examining this franchise through the perspective of Mulvey's theory was also useful in helping me see how unconscious I was to the implicit bias and role of Zelda's submissiveness in the games. I never really questioned why Zelda wasn't the master of her own destiny. I always knew it was so Link could save the day. However, that conclusion never seemed problematic, and while I still personally don't consider it a huge deal, I can now see the perspective of those who seek to have Zelda play a bigger role in the franchise, bigger than the girl who throws you some light arrows at the end of the game so you can defeat Ganon.